So, you're curious about what's real and you want to know if there's actually a world out there. And if there is, why? And if there isn't, then what's all of this? Is there a God? How does all of this even work? The first question you should ask yourself is, what is wrong with me? And then, after giving yourself the best answer you can to soothe your existential crisis of a mind, you can enter into the world of a great philosopher. Enter George Berkeley. He says that there is no material world, and that only our perceptions exist, and God is the one who orchestrates it all. Now, you might say something along the lines of, huh? And that's why I'm going to explain all of this. All right, so let's start. Berkeley breaks down the idea of a material world, quote unquote. Importantly, he's talking about a material world that exists outside of our sensations, meaning it's still there even when we're not sensing it, which I think is what we all mean when we talk about the material world. Well, Berkeley says this is impossible. Well, let's look at why that is. Well, why do you think there's a material world? Well, because you see it, you hear it, you feel it, so on and so on, meaning you sense it, you perceive it. Well, what happens when you sense a table? You say the table is brown because I see it that way. It smells like wood and it feels smooth, and that is how I smell and that is how I feel it. Well then, if this table exists outside of you sensing it, that means the table is brown. Brown by itself. It owns the quality of being brown, whether or not you identify it that way. But hang on. What happens if you stand so far back that the table begins to become obscure and the color changes to you? What if at the same time you see a brown table, your friend has a microscope and he sees the table with all the different colors that can be seen using a microscope? Well, Berkeley says that the table can't own the quality of being brown because of this, since it is dependent on how we perceive the table. The brownness of the table, in other words, is not consistent with you perceiving it. And as far as we are concerned, the only proof that we have that the table is brown is that we see it as brown. And the same is true with every single way that we perceive an object, and every single object that we perceive. Now, Berkeley uses this example. He says, water cannot own the quality of being hot or cold. Because if I have one hand that is hot and one hand that is cold, and I place them into the same body of water, the same water will feel cold to one hand and warm to the other. Therefore, the feeling of hot or cold cannot exist within the water. So, what does this mean? It means that it's all in our heads, or as he puts it, it's all in our perceptions. The table may not be there, but our perception of it is. In other words, the table exists, just so far as our perception of it, which means that if the table isn't being perceived, then there is no table, since the table, well, is the perception. Well then, Mr. Berkeley, you might say, this theory is dumb, stupid, and dumb. If there's no table with anyone seeing the table, then why is the table still there when I come back? And if all of this happens in our heads, then why do we all see a table? And not, I see a table, you see a chair, some other dude sees an entire tank. Now, why doesn't that happen if there's not actually a table there to impose the sensation of a table on all of us? Why doesn't that happen, smart guy? Well, once you're done reveling in smug genius, Berkeley would answer your question in one word. God. Why is the table still there once we leave the room and return? Because God was sensing it. That's what it means to be omnipresent, which is what God is. Everywhere, at all times. Nothing goes unsensed, and so nothing vanishes, because God continually senses it. And why do we consistently perceive things with other table? Why do we all see a table if there is no table? Well, a table doesn't make you perceive a table, because first of all, the hypothetical table is inactive. It wouldn't be able to make you do anything anyways. It's God. God imposes on all of our minds the image and sensation of a table. God is the orchestrator of our perceptions. It is He who makes us sense everything. It is He that keeps these things consistent enough for us to have mutual understanding. but inconsistent enough for each of these perceptions to make an impact particular to each one of us. Now, you could say, wait a minute. Why can't it be that God just uses the material world to impose those perceptions, like he's using a tool, instead of doing it all himself? That way we could have perceptions that could be unique, and we could have a material world. Okay, because first of all, it wouldn't change the fact that we all perceive these things differently, which wouldn't make sense. If there's actually a material world, then it should apply to all of us equally, because the material wouldn't change from person to person. That's what it means for something to be real. And also, God doesn't need tools. He's God. You might need a wrench to tighten a bolt because your little baby hands can't handle it, but God doesn't have that issue. Okay, here comes the confusing part. If that wasn't already confusing. You could say, now wait right there, Mr. Berkeley. Let's suppose that there are objects. But I agree, they don't own the qualities that we perceive, meaning the table is actually there in some form or another. It's just only our perception of the table that is brown, or our perception of the table that it feels like wood. Okay, so this is all to say there are real objects in the world. We don't immediately perceive them, but what we do perceive is the ideas of these objects. And these ideas can change from person to person and from situation to situation. All of this is to say that there are objects, but we don't see them. What we see are our ideas of them. Therefore, even though the only things that we can perceive are our ideas, these ideas are at least like the real thing that they represent. And we come to gather these ideas from our senses and memories and whatnot. So our ideas of the objects are at least similar to the real objects. Now, Berkeley would stare at you for a second and then answer the question with another question. How can an idea be anything but another idea? You see, this concept that there are objects that we can't perceive, and we have ideas that we can perceive, and that they are like each other, doesn't make any sense. Berkeley would say, how could your idea of a table, a thing that is brown and wood-like and textured, be anything like the quote-unquote real table that is without color and without texture? If your idea of something is just your perception of that something, and the real thing is defined by its characteristics of having no perceivable qualities, how could they be anything like one another? How could a sound be anything like the inaudible, as Berkeley would say? In conclusion, there are no real objects, only our perceptions. Now that you've been thoroughly defeated by the superior intellect of a genius, you have to believe that there's no material world. Or not. You could just look at the tree and say, hey, look, a tree, and move the fuck. Anyways, that's all I got. I hope you enjoyed, and maybe you learned something. Who knows? And that concludes this episode. Thanks for watching.